Look, your take then on this, positive in some ways, reduction in inflation, but not as fast as I suppose any of us would like to see.
No, well, I think that's the point, isn't it? It's good that the inflation rate has gone down, but nobody should be putting out the bunting if we're talking about inflation over 10%. I mean, it's still the third worst inflation figures for 40 years. So, no, nothing, I'm afraid, to celebrate. I mean, maybe we're going in the right direction, but, we've got a long way to go.
So it vindicates the Chancellor then in his hard line on these negotiations with the unions, because he's absolutely clear by giving these inflation-busting pay rises across the board to public sector workers will stoke inflation, and that is the single biggest enemy, biggest problem we're facing.
Yeah, I'm not sure, because I don't think that that the government is thinking of giving people above 10% pay rises, but they're talking about giving them well below 10%. And obviously, therefore, that means that people in public services are effectively being told that they should take pay cuts for the sake of inflation. And when we see that the inflation rate is not... It may not be entirely the fault of the government, but, government behaviour has not exactly helped. And so the inflation rate in this country is worse because we've had 13 years of failure by this Conservative government, particularly recently with the reckless behaviour of Kwasi Kwarteng and the kamikaze budget that he introduced, which has had a direct result in terms of bringing up interest rates when it comes to people paying their mortgages.
And the Chancellor, I'm sure, would probably agree that that is a huge challenge for him to try and tackle. But as you generously say, not entirely the fault of the government. We're seeing global inflation struggling, not least because of this war that's being fought in Ukraine. But also, as the Governor of the Bank of England has argued, we're seeing problems in this country due to labour shortages, worker shortages. What would Labour do about that? Because we know that Sir Keir Starmer wanted to remain in the EU, as did you. How would you solve that problem?
So, as Keir said, what we need to do is we need to be able to train up people in Britain to be able to fill some of the vacancies that we have in Britain. That would be the ideal. But in the meantime, it's right that we ask people to come from other countries, and we do it on the basis of a points-based immigration system, which is what we think should happen. And at the moment, it's just not happening. And yes, we're seeing all kinds of industries that are having terrible trouble filling vacancies, and that isn't helping with growth. Far from it. In fact, we've had a government that has manifestly failed to grow the economy. I mean, I'm not even asking them to be as good as we were when we were in government with the amount of growth that we had. But at least it would be good if we were as good as our international competitors. But no, we have been bumping along the bottom when it comes to growth for far too many years, and are now in negative growth.
Well, the PM today is promising to try and conduct a bonfire of EU laws in a bid to boost growth.
Well, I think that the PM may say that, but I suspect that it's got more to do with keeping the right wing of his backbenchers happy. I think that the difficulty is that we were in the EU for some 50 years. There is a very large amount of legislation that we adopted from the EU, and we can't be confident that we have introduced legislation to replace it. And so the idea of kind of just burning it all up at the end of the year and let's see what happens is a kind of reckless behaviour that, frankly, this country can do without, particularly if some of that legislation protects environmental standards or employment rights or health standards. All of these things actually are important and are important to get right, and shouldn't be, burnt away on some pyre which is all to do with Tory dogma and not to do with what's good for the country.
Talk about keeping the benches happy. I want to talk to you about this emergency debate that took place in the Commons yesterday in relation to the gender debate that's happening, Scottish Parliament passing a law which Westminster has now blocked. An important, a serious debate being conducted in the Commons yesterday, and yet a female member of your party, Rosie Duffield, being heckled, being laughed at, being sneered at by her colleagues, all of whom were male, from within her own party. What do you make of that? It's not a good look.
So I was in the chamber during the front bench speeches on this, and yes, it's about the Gender Recognition Act, which has been introduced in Scotland and the Conservative government has now vetoed, with Section 33 of the devolution powers. And there was supposed to be a debate around it. I have to say, I don't recognise your characterisation of it being a serious and careful debate.
OK, but what about Rosie Duffield, your colleague, in her own words, who described that male colleagues were laughing at her?
I mean, I certainly heard one of my colleagues saying, no, Rosie, that just isn't right. I mean, I did hear that.
Ben Bradshaw dismissing it as nonsense.
I was a couple of rows in front of her. And then I heard a lot, maybe it was being drowned out by the Conservatives on the other side, who I could hear shouting, go on, Rosie, you're right, etc., etc. I mean, this was not a debate that was, frankly, Parliament's finest hour, in my view. I think on the one hand, we had the Conservatives wanting to stoke some sort of culture wars, and on the other hand, we had the Scottish nationalists, deciding that they were going to sort of fight the battle of nationalism again. And that's what it was all about. And frankly, the last thing that anyone was thinking about, in my view, was the very marginalised people, those people who are some of the most vulnerable in our society, who are trans people. And also there were being no clear debate to reassure women who are concerned, some women who are concerned about women-only safe spaces.
Yeah. Well, look,
that seems to be such a long way down the agenda of so many people who are there.
Sounds to me as if you are unconcerned then that a women's campaigner was being laughed at by men in the Commons. But anyway, look, we're out of time. I just want a yes or no answer on this.
Well, you can say that, and that would not be true, but you can say what you like.
I'm just saying that's what it sounded like. I mean, you can disagree, but it sounded like you're unconcerned by it. Listen,
well, I don't know. All I can say is that I was there and that wasn't what I saw.
OK, well, your colleague argues differently. Anyway, I want to ask you a yes or no answer. Was Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, right to block Scottish law, and would Labour have done the same?
We would not have done the same thing. We would have negotiated with the Scottish Parliament, because that is the only way that it can be sorted out. It can either be sorted out through the courts, which looks like it's where it's going to go, or it could have been done in a grown-up way, which is the UK Parliament and the Scottish Parliament could have sat down together and said, OK, gender recognition is something which is devolved, equality is something which is not. There will obviously be border issues as a result. We need to sort out what happens in the middle. We need to be able to sort this out. And you should be doing that by discussing things. But all we got was Kemi Badenoch turning up the day before the legislation was passed. That's not exactly negotiations, is it?